This is lecture 12 in the Western Peace tradition. And in this lecture, what I'll be doing is moving from the 16th century, building on Erasmus, which you'll have seen in the earlier lecture, a discussion of him, moving fairly hastily up to the 20th century in the formation of the United Nations, which was seen as a premier peacekeeping organization, at least in principle, although obviously not always in practice. So 16th century Erasmus, the first dilemma in terms of conflict which emerged was the Protestant critique of what was seen as the corrupt Roman Catholic Church that could not be reformed, or so the reformers thought anyway. And as a result of that, there is the birth of Lutheran Christianity, Reformed Christianity, of which Calvin, coming out of Switzerland, Geneva was essential, the rise of the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, Baptist tradition, Quaker tradition. There's a whole rise of fragmentations in the 16th century, which in one sense is the birth of our modern world. Now these fragmentations at one level obviously were birthed out of a critique of the Roman Catholic Church, a critique that also took the position that the Roman Catholic Church could not be meaningfully reformed, and hence the birth of various Christian denominations in the sense. Erasmus took the middle position in all of this. He argued yet, yes, the Roman Catholic Church needed to be reformed, but to begin the process of fragmenting and splintering, he argued, eventually where it would lead to is the total disintegration in many ways, not only of the Christian church itself, which was supposed to be in principle about unity and oneness and concord, recognizing there would always be diversity and unity, but divisiveness was a failure of love at the deepest level for Erasmus. Erasmus got caught in the middle between, on the one hand, critiquing the Roman Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church turned on him for that because he continued quite far down the path with Luther in the critique. But he was a strong believer in unity as well, as any person interested in peace would be. Where there is conflict, what are the means that can be used to overcome the conflict for unity or reconciliation? This is always the dilemma of anyone who's engaged in peacemaking, peacekeeping, is there's the tendency on the one hand for people not to critique for the purpose of unity, but when people critique, what often leads is disunity. People cannot agree on where they want to go, or the reform they would like to see, or the direction they would like to go, so fragmentation occurs. It's much more difficult to hold together the commitment to unity with criticism. The reformers slipped into criticize and fragment, and in that sense we can see the ongoing nature of that today, where we get various positions ideologically, people fragmenting, turning on one another. Well, this is just a secularized form of really the 16th century Reformation. Often the religious impetus is not there. It's identity politics or gender politics or environmental politics, a whole range of other issues. But people within these various ideological commitments, both within and between, they can't agree, so they fragment and fragment and fragment. That's a line and lineage really of the Reformation itself. Erasmus tried to be a peacekeeper, and the dilemma often when you're trying to see the good of both sides, or the truth in both sides, but also see the limitations in both sides, ideologues don't like that. They like to be fully they take positions in which you're either committed to us or you're not. If you're not, you're the enemy, you're the opponent, you're the opposite. And so when people either think in either or, my tribe, your clan, that clan, a peacekeeper often who tries to build bridges is often seen as a Judas figure who won't salute at the flagpole of any tribe. And so Erasmus suffered the fate, and he was put on the index from the Roman Catholic Treaty of Trent all the way up to Vatican II in the 1960s. And so in that sense, Erasmus is a parable, a living parable, and a mentor, the price to be paid for peacekeeping. As you move forward, though, with the fragmentation of denominations within Christianity and the breakup of Christendom as a civilization, what occurred, the denominations began to align themselves with particular states. And so Lutheranism in Germany, as I mentioned, the Reformed tradition, the significant elements of that in Switzerland, moving up into Holland, tensions in Holland between the Roman Catholics and the variations of Calvinist Protestantism. And go from different states, but what happens then is not only in the midst of conflict do you have splitting up into denominations, but you then have alliances between particular denominations and the rise of the nation states themselves. And so there's this convergence then between denominational Christianity and the rise of the nation state. And with this, again, conflicts emerge. Each state and religion thinking its embodiment of politics and religion is the truest and the best. And out of this become the horrendous religious wars of the 17th century, in which millions are killed in the name of both politics and religion. And so the desire for peace, on the one hand, of unity, concord, remains in conflict with discord, disunity. And so this issue of war, peace, conflict, leading to either discord or concord, continues through the 16th, 17th century then, from the birth of the denominations, the linking up of denominations with nation states. And it's out of that, because of the sheer implications and violence of nation-state conflict, that you get what's called the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. I might also add that following Erasmus is a very important thinker in terms of the peace tradition and international law. In many ways, Erasmus and this particular thinker, Hugo Grotius, prepare the way for international standards which transcend denominational interest as well as nation states' interests. They're looking at a higher moral ethic that all states and religions should abide by, that brings about some minimal level of peace so that conflict, war, and the carnage that comes from that will not persist. But what happens, of course, as we're moving through history then from the 16th to the 17th century, there on the one hand there's the idealist tradition, which is trying to articulate and put into place laws and standards by which states and religions are meant to adhere to. On the other hand, you get various denominations and states always subordinating that to national and religious interests. And so there's always this clash between idealism and realism, the peacekeeper who looks at the larger international unity question, and the realist who tends to think of their tribal particular interests. As we move through history, of course, what's going on? A variety, obviously, of nation states continue to collide. To move quickly in terms of, say, Europe, Napoleon comes to power, of course, in England, 1688, the Glorious Revolution, but again, Cromwell engaging in violence and the sheer carnage there, war, the longing for peace, the Glorious Revolution, late 17th century. Not sure how glorious it was for those who died, but there was, as a result of that, at least some level of trying to articulate and create a state by which conflict was handled in a non-violent, peaceful way through law, through the courts, through voting, and a variety of other means itself. And move forward through history, you get the French Revolution and violence again. The argument was that the old elite of the wealthy aristocrats and the Roman Catholic Church attachment to that led to terrible oppression of the lower class, the working class, so 1789 and then the 1790s. The violence which erupts here, the belief that peace without justice leads to totalitarianism and repression. So what often happens in this clash between justice and peace, you can get people concerned with justice but use violence to bring it about, and you can have people who are very concerned with peace but often not just in their understanding of how that is to be lived and articulated. The French Revolution was an attempt to bring about justice for the lower working class, the peasants, but in the process not a lot of peaceful means by which this was embodied. Napoleon, of course, finally he builds on the French Revolution and becomes very aggressive. So here we get the movement towards increasingly an attempt to unify Europe again. It's his attempt to embody the Holy Roman Empire, which had disintegrated through Protestant fragmentation into nation states and denominations. But in his aggressiveness, inevitably from which the great novel Lev Tolstoy's War and Peace emerges, he invades Russia in 1812 without realizing that the deadliness of Russian winters would have an impact on him, and the amount of time they took getting into Russia led to the retreat. But here you have the attempt to create a unified, peaceful Europe in a more secular way, comparable to the Holy Roman Empire of the Roman Catholic tradition, but the violence that was used to bring that about. Napoleon's final defeat in 1815 at Waterloo by the English was again war and peace. You have people competing for whose version of peace, and who's the one who should implement that version. Should it be an aggressive imperial power, in this case Russia, or should it be, of course, England is beginning to emerge at this time as an empire also, as well as France and many others. So you always get this notion of peace, whose version of peace, just peace, and so these things increasingly unfold. As we move into the 20th century, of course, plenty of wars, plenty of deaths that linger in the West. You get to World War I, and out of this comes the League of Nations. So World War I, fragments between various nation states in Europe. Again, the tragedies, the violence which emerged, an attempt to form an international organization which would be an agent of peace. And the tension then in certainly the West is, you've got the Westphalian tradition, which a state is sovereign and is not beholden to any power above it. And then we have these organizations which argue that states are beholden to a higher good or a greater unity. And when there's a clash between the notion of a higher unity and state sovereignty, just as there's a clash between peace and justice, inevitably what happens is that peace gets subordinated to ideology, or a broader notion of peace gets subordinated to nation-state interests. And so the 20th century is a clash between the individualism of nation-statism and the desire for greater unity that can bring peace, and various means and mechanisms by which that is done. Obviously, the League of Nations falters and fails with the rise of nation-states, and particularly Nazism, fascism, Franco in Spain. And so the carnage which emerges in World War II is the rise of an ethnic nationalism. The Germans felt that they were mistreated at Versailles. The Italians, the whole movement under Mussolini, and obviously Franco in Spain. And as a result of that, you get the clash again between war and peace. In many of these cases, it's more ethnic nationalism. Obviously, further north, you're getting the rise of communism, so well depicted. Some of you may be aware this is the 60th year this year since Boris Pasternak died in 1960. His great novel, Dr. Zhivago, certainly worth reading, and anyone who finishes their BA should have a good feel for Boris Pasternak's great novel, War and Peace, that takes place, or Dr. Zhivago, but it immersed in the carnage and the violence of the transition in Russia from 1917 forward, and the implications on people's lives. It's sort of in many ways a complementary read to Lev Tolstoy's War and Peace. It gives you the sense what happens when the fabric of society begins to erode, when you get a class of people feel they have been underrepresented, treated unjustly by an aristocratic class, the rebellions, the revolutions that takes place, and then the sheer violence. So Pasternak describes this very, very well in Dr. Zhivago. So war and peace, these are themes that emerge not only within the human soul, in terms of the clashes of different desires, the conflicts that go on, but within human nature itself. It spills over into relationships, friendships, families, communities, and on the larger macro scale, the same principles are ever fleshed out as they develop. And so when we go from the 16th century, from Erasmus, sort of a whistle-stop tour through from the 16th to the 20th century, we can see these themes ever played out in, even to this day, the United Nations, an agent of peace, but when the General Secretary or when the various agencies of the UN are calling for peace or justice, General Assembly, and it collides with nation-state interests, which gets the final say? Well, inevitably, because most of politics today is worked out on a Westphalian tradition, the nation-state, well, the one gets the final say, and the United Nations, even though in theory about unity and about peace, always plays second fiddle to the main instruments in the orchestra, which are nation-states. I'd like to just finish with a short story here. It's the next one in the Legends of Vancouver. It's called The Squamish Legend of Napoleon. It's a very interesting one. It's number 12 in Legends of Vancouver. Most people don't think of Squamish and First Nations having an interest in Napoleon. And so where does this come from? So Pauline Johnson, again, is in conversation. In that sense, this legend fits in nicely with this one. As I mentioned earlier, there's a story of the serpent and the First Nations person who was taken in by the lust for gold and wealth, and he became a serpent. And then the other brave, the other warrior who killed the serpent, and as a result of the serpent, he managed to get one of the vertebrae of the serpent, which became a talisman. And so the battle to destroy greed and those who are driven by the addiction to greed and wealth and property and possessions, they become serpents in that sense. In another sense, they become like dwarves. They shrink as people. And those who challenge that in the serpent story are the ones who, in this particular story, destroy the serpent and their greater people for overcoming those lesser or baser desires. But from the story, the belief was that he or she who had this talisman would be a great warrior, because this talisman, which was taken from the serpent, was a symbol of those who could overcome this temptation to greed and wealth. And as one of the great chiefs was dying, he had this talisman passed on to him. And as he was dying, he wanted it to be given to, interestingly enough, Frenchmen, as he felt the French should have it, and wonder what's the relationship between Squamish and the older First Nation story of the French, and where did this story come from? Very unusual when you think of Squamish or First Nations legends to have Napoleon hooked into it. But as he's dying, he wanted it to be given to Frenchmen. And so there happened to be a Russian ship had come into the inlet in Vancouver at the time, and there were two French people who were captives by the Russians, and they'd come to shore. And so the wife of the chief took them aside and they asked them who they were and why they were on a Russian ship. And they said they, in the battle with the French, I mentioned earlier the French invasion of Russia in 1812 under Napoleon, and then the Russian defeat of the French in that particular war that Tolstoy so well articulates in War and Peace. They gave this, so the chief's wife gave this talisman to the Frenchmen, and they said, can you take it back to France, because it allows you to defeat serpents or evil or injustice. And so the two Frenchmen, they're a bit worried, a bit superstitious themselves. What is this talisman, and what happens when I hold it? And is it magical, and what will it do to us and to others? But they took it. They get back on the Russian ship, and as soon as they get on ship, all the Russians fall over because of the power of the talisman. And so the Frenchmen managed to finally get back to France, and they give this talisman to Napoleon, because the belief was if you held this talisman, just as the early warrior defeated the serpent, those who held it would defeat all their enemies. And so the story goes that Napoleon did very well in his early wars, and his aggressiveness throughout Europe and into Egypt and moving into Africa and other places. But then he was finally defeated, as I mentioned earlier, 1812 in Russia, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo with the English. So what was the explanation for why Napoleon was defeated? Well, so the story goes, and it returns that what happened just before the French forces went into Russia, Napoleon lost the talisman, and that was his source of power that allowed him to be victorious up to that point. An interesting story anyway, interesting in the fact that First Nations, a certain attachment to Napoleon, who's very aggressive war, which is very interesting, but there is this history obviously in First Nations traditions of warriors and battles and clashes between tribes, but the myth itself then stretches to Europe itself. And if you attach yourself to the French, then the Russians are the problem. Attach yourself to the French and Napoleon, the English are the problem. And so when we come back to the war and peace issue, certainly within First Nations stories, there is this understanding not only between tribes and within tribes, clashes and tensions and violence, but this myth of the talisman and Napoleon reflects a tendency within First Nations also to engage in the larger issues of war and peace, and who is the primary agent to bring peace, and at what cost, and who are the victims of that. So this overview then from Erasmus up to the 20th century, looking at the various people and organizations that try and embody concord, unity, and then the opposite of that, which is discord and disunity and fragmentation. These are a part of the history that will forever go on, because it seems to be a perennial part of the human condition, which we'll be exploring as we move on in the course of some of these great themes, and idealism and realism and war and peace, and how does one make sense of this without being naive idealists, and the other hand without being aggressive realists. And so from now on in the course, we're going to be looking at some of the major themes in terms of causes of war, negative peace, positive peace, peace movements, and a variety of other issues that bring us into the 20th century. I might also add this: we have stayed and lingered a little longer with Western peace traditions. There have obviously been in other cultures, China, India, Middle East, Africa, focused a little bit on Europe, or Mediterranean Europe tradition. But if we had time to linger in them, we can see exactly these same tensions of war and peace as a constant refrain. And then the question is, where does the aggressive nature of war come from? Where does the longing for peace come from? And is it possible to overcome the destructive elements of aggressiveness in people, or is this part of who they are as well as the longing for peace? And it's in these tensions between idealism and peace and realism in war that the human journey ever unfolds, and probably will continue to unfold well into the future.